need also, George.
Yeah, I have some problem.
Oh dear. Ah. Oh dear. Dear colleagues, dear friends, I would like to start by expressing my thanks to Jette Sandahl, the chair of the Museum Definition, Prospects and Potentials Standing Committee, and to all and each of the members of this committee of Museum Definition for a work they accomplished through a process which was democratic, transparent, and inclusive for a new definition of the museum. This is best practice for us, and we have now 4,000 people discussing what a museum is, only here. I don't know how many outside of this room. The role of museums in society is changing. Museums keep reinventing themselves in their quest for becoming more interactive, inclusive, community-oriented, accountable, flexible, and mobile. In other words, for staying relevant, while preserving their primary missions: collecting, preservation, communication, research, exhibition, learning. Museums have transformed their practices to remain closer to the communities they serve. As museums increasingly grow into their roles as cultural hubs, they are also finding new ways to honor their collections, their histories, and their legacies, creating traditions that will have new meaning for future generations and relevance for an increasingly diverse contemporary audience at a global level. This transformation, which will have a profound impact on museum theory and practice, also forces us to rethink the value of museums and to question the ethical boundaries that define the very nature of our work as museum professionals. ICOM is changing, as museums are changing, and as does society change. The growing emphasis on the social role of museums, as underlined by the 2015 UNESCO recommendation on the protection and promotion of museums and collections, their diversity and their role in society, necessitates us to closely watch the societal trends, as well as the willingness, readiness to address contemporary societal issues, which are very often contested and political in their nature. The latest report of the United Nations High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development, which I also mentioned yesterday, of 2019, warns us about two main issues by saying the impacts of climate change and increasing inequality across and within countries are undermining progress on the sustainable development agenda, threatening to reverse many of the gains made over the last decades that have improved people's lives. Climate change and increasing inequalities across and within countries. This is to underline. These are not political statements, but serious facts. And the increasing inequalities is the biggest challenge of our sector, as it is to many others. As ICOM president, I try to do my best to seek change as a global museum organization and proactively address these societal and therefore museological trends and challenges to reflect contemporary issues on our work in order to remain relevant. Revisiting our core values and professional standards, such as the ICOM Museum Definition and ICOM Code of Ethics, can be seen among these efforts. It is us, our committees and members, who will transmit our professional values to the future generations of museum professionals. Our aim should be to provide them with the tools that will serve them the best when solving their problems, both as citizens of our planet and as prospective members of the international museum community. I hope that this plenary session on museum definition will provide us with new perspectives when rethinking our role within society. Without going further, I would like to invite Jette Sandahl, Chair of ICOM's Standing Committee on Museum Definition, Prospects and Potentials, to chair this second plenary, of course, session of the ICOM's 25th General Conference. Thank you, Jette.
Thank you, Madam President. Thank you, Suai. And thank you to ICOM and the organizing committee for dedicating this plenary to the futures of museums and the museum definition. I'm pleased and proud to have with me in this panel a group of distinguished scholars, thinkers, professionals who use their knowledge and resources in the empowerment of people and communities and the well-being of the planet Earth. We had some confusion about where we were. I think while I talk, I think you should just walk up and take your chairs here because it feels a little bit strange to speak to the absence here. All our speakers today are also represented in this new thematic issue of the Museum International, which you've all got in your conference pack and which is freely available also on the ICOM website for members. The last couple of decades has seen an almost continuous intent within ICOM to revise the museum definition. And when the Museum Definition Prospects and Potentials Committee was appointed as a new standing committee in 2017, we built on the processes and experience of previous working groups. For the last couple of years, our committee has explored, researched, and observed current societal trends as they impact museums and analyzed the historic background and the epistemological roots of the museum concept. We've listened to museum communities and discussed with them the shifts in paradigms that have appeared unevenly and incompletely, but yet consistently to the relationship between museums and the societies around us. Over recent decades, museums have adjusted, transformed, and reinvented their purpose, policies, and practices to the point where the ICOM museum definition no longer feels adequate in reflecting or supporting our challenges and manifold responsibilities and visions for the future. A report summarizing our thoughts and deliberations as a committee is also available on the ICOM website and is printed also in this issue of the Museum International. In December 2018, the Executive Board adopted this report and our recommendations to initiate a process of collecting and developing new alternative museum definitions with a view to a change in the ICOM statutes. Invitations to participate were sent to all ICOM national and international committees, regional alliances, affiliated organizations, standing committees and working groups, as well as to selected partners and stakeholders. On the ICOM website, everyone was invited to upload a proposal in their own language. Contributions were labeled by country and origin. The format was free. It was, however, encouraged that the new definitions, to the extent possible, should reflect and include the 8 parameters that provided a crucial framework in our recommendations and the Executive Board decision. 269 proposals for an alternative museum definition were were received from 69 different countries and in 25 different languages through the ICOM website. And it would be interesting sometime when we have time to look at the regional contribution of these contributions, because they were really, really interesting and surprising. After a rigorous layered process of analyzing, filtering, and shortlisting proposals in accordance with the principles and criteria of the original parameters, we submitted a selection of 5 different alternative museum definitions to the ICOM Executive Board. At this point, these proposals were all edited hybrids, combining core elements and words from across the 269 original proposals in accordance again with the parameters. This plenary session here was planned way before, long time before the alternative definition was chosen, and what we're discussing in this session is not the specific definition or its phrasing, but rather some of the intellectual framework within which a definition is developed. Changing a museum definition is one that's adequate for our time is no mere technical exercise. It's a process of understanding the embeddedness of museums in society, of contextualizing, historicizing, denaturalizing the current definition, and of developing a new ethical position that reflects current challenges and obligations. Our plenary session here focuses on these societal, epistemological, and museological issues surrounding the ICOM museum definition, and they tie in with the prospects and future potentials of museums. The contributions today thus anchor this discussion of the future of museums and a future museum definition within a wider societal context. The future of museums are shaped amidst global concerns and conflicts over climate change and the destruction of nature, over displacement and mass migration, over wars, inequality and neocolonialism, over paradigmatic shifts in scientific discourses in major institutions of knowledge building and identity building like museums. And as the awareness grows among museum professionals that museums are inextricably part of and active agents in society, the need for a shared set of values and an explicit ethical foundation is voiced with corresponding frequency and urgency. And most interestingly, while in the past a contradiction or opposition has often been presumed between the social purposes and the collection-based museum functions, between community involvement and the role of experts, museums today actively strive to fulfill their social and democratic purposes exactly through their unique and particular museum functions, museum methods and expertise, through the collecting, preserving, documenting, researching, exhibiting, and communicating the collections and other evidence of cultural heritage. We are these days consistently talking both and much more than we talk either or. Our first 2 speakers today discuss how the paradigms of previous historic periods in the current context can become almost opticals in addressing urgent contemporary issues, and how a traditional Western framework needs to be and can be transcended. The binary hierarchies, the splits and divisions, the either-ors, and not least the conceptual opposition between culture and nature are proving more and more problematic in the 21st century, as we just witnessed here. All this epistemological and political and professional impasse of Western scientific traditions, powerful alternative positions are developed and practiced with increasing self-confidence in museums that are rooted in non-Western cosmologies and worldviews. More holistic approaches voice and practice a fundamental non-binary, non-bifurcated connectivity and the interrelatedness of all things. These epistemologies have been influential on a global scale, also in rebalancing the relationship between museums and communities across the sector. Richard West takes his point of departure in this new type of museum. Authoritative first-person voice and a holistic view of art and culture represented a dramatic paradigmatic shift and a departure from previous epistemological dictates in museum interpretation and practice, he writes in the Museum International. Richard West serves as president and CEO of the Autry Museum of the American West and is known also as the founding director of the National Museum of the American Indian. He's a citizen of the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes of Oklahoma and a member of the Southern Cheyenne Society of Peace Chiefs. And in our ICOM context, he's clearly also known as a former vice president. Please welcome Richard West.
Thank you. Good morning. I am honored to spend time with you this morning, and I begin by thanking our Japanese hosts for their generous hospitality in making this occasion possible. No analysis of global museology and epistemological practice during the past generation can dispute significant, indeed transformational change. I want to talk briefly today about the roots, dynamics, and results of that evolution. I address these subjects based upon my experience as the director of museums in the United States, first as the founding director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian, and currently as the president and chief executive officer of the Autry Museum of the American West in Los Angeles. Both institutions hold substantial collections of the cultural patrimony of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. Epistemological practice in American museums was born of the Enlightenment and Western rationalism, driven in curatorial interpretation by the binary division of culture and nature. That dividing line subsequently produced numerous subdivided disciplines and additional splits: culture and science, art and culture, and history and art, for example. At the National Museum of the American Indian's inception in 1990, Robert McCormick Adams Jr., my first boss and head of the Smithsonian, signaled a profound departure from the museological legacies of the Western Enlightenment. Said he, "This is a national museum that takes the permanence and the authenticity, the vitality and self-determination of Native American voices as the fundamental reality it must represent." We moved decisively from the older image of the museum as a temple with its superior self-governing priesthood to a forum committed not to the promulgation of received wisdom, but to the encouragement of a multicultural dialogue. Adams' declaration had multiple epistemological implications, explicit and implicit, which can be summarized as follows. First, for purposes of interpretation, the first-person native voice was to be treated as authentic and authoritative. Second, Native peoples were living in contemporary cultural communities with a future rather than merely historical or ethnographic remnants. Third, all knowledge and knowledge creation do not sit solely within the museum as the temple on the hill. Fourth, in addition to other roles, museums are civic space and forums for conversation and debate with porous and bilateral edges interacting with community audiences and constituencies. This shift was by no means limited to the National Museum of the American Indian. Other institutions holding indigenous collections, from the Museum of Civilization in Canada with its First Nations collections to the Maori collections at Te Papa in New Zealand, charted similar paths. But, and this point is central in discussing epistemological change, it is not the what of it, but the why of it that is most paramount. Addressing the latter speak to the seminal core of why new approaches are essential, and it is this. Across the globe, the creation of knowledge systems differs, and often profoundly so. That statement is not a concession in the name of political correctness, but indeed represents cultural realities that are epistemologically profound and need to be acted upon. Let me offer an example. Penny Allen and Johanna Smith emphasize the following with respect to the Maori community. Importantly, a Maori approach to science is not based on the dualistic assumptions of a Western scientific epistemology. The distinctions of separations between professional scientists and non-scientific stakeholders, theory and practice, subject and object, start and finish, theory and practice, past and present, are subsumed by a holistic approach that considers a whole of person and a whole of system, thereby a theory of knowing. These transformed interpretive approaches have been buttressed for a generation by several collateral and legal ethical developments. I close this morning by focusing on the implications of what I have said for 21st century museums. The popular perception is that these great institutions are principally cultural destinations that somehow sit apart from the society's mainstream and the societies in which they serve, not a part of everyday life, over there instead of right here among us. But they can and should be far more than that in the 21st century. The substantial changes that have occurred in museum epistemologies and interpretive practices, especially as they relate to the representation of cultural communities, and especially those that are indigenous, offer multiple possibilities and potentialities. This transformation in approach also has direct impact going forward on the very nature of the museum as a public institution. We struggle in the 21st century and as a global basis, and on a global basis, to find and implement civic and social space, these gathering places for discourse, debate, even controversy, but always a safe place for unsafe ideas concerning culture and human experience. Museums represent at least the opportunity to serve as a notable chink in that contemporary armor of political and social polarities and the disabling cultural and historical gloom they engender. The museum as counterpoint, although not able to do everything, can do something, and a very important something. That hope and aspiration should be the intellectual and museological and epistemological aspiration of all museums and how we define ourselves and our future in the 21st century. And on our collective journey to that worthy aspiration, I offer these words of support and encouragement in my own native language, Cheyenne. Namaheo, Najame Viet Sem, Najame Viet Hats, Hotse Ohest, Na Semkhan, Nidahoai Sepeva, Janishe, Nishevet. And in English, which, and I don't expect our distinguished translators to have quite gotten the translation from Cheyenne, but in English, it is this: Maheo, the great mystery, walks beside you and walks beside your work and touches all the good that you attempt. Thank you very much.
We ignore the alarming crisis of the destruction of nature and the unsustainable relationship between people and the rest of nature at our peril. With a focus on urban planning and the built environment, our next speaker, Nirmal Kishnani, identifies how crucially important ecological systems are overlooked in the conflicts between social and economical forces. Several binaries dominate the narrative: urban versus rural, rich versus poor, private versus public, and formal versus informal. Unresolved and festering, these binaries induce destabilizing tension among parts within a whole, triggering systemic fragmentation, he says in the Museum International. He also provides examples of how and what it takes to turn this logic around in urban planning. Nirmal Kishnani is an associate professor at the National University of Singapore, teaching sustainable design. He's the editor-in-chief of FuturArc magazine. His book, Greening Asia, Emerging Principles for Sustainable Architecture, is considered a milestone publication on the subject of green building. And his next book, Ecopuncture, Transforming Architecture and Urbanism in Asia, will be out very soon. Please welcome Nirmal Kishnani.
Good morning. very glad to be here with you in Kyoto. Thank you for the invitation. I promised Jette that I would finish in 7 minutes, so please bear with me if I race a little bit. I fully expect the voice recognition system to scramble everything I'm saying, so just ignore that if you will. To start us off, here are some facts and figures about the built environment. Buildings consume over 1/3 of the world's resources. They are major emitters of greenhouse gases, which cause global warming. Asia is building faster than anywhere else on the planet. Just to give you a sense of that, in the space of 3 years, from 2011 to 2014, China consumed more concrete than the United States did in all of the 20th century. In this very complex and rapidly changing world, architects and planners often see their world through a prism of binaries. A binary is a way of saying I can realistically do this or I can do that, but not both. To illustrate some of these binaries, I will rely on Mumbai, a city in India, and this image by Johnny Miller. I should just very quickly add that I picked Mumbai not because it's exceptionally problematic, but because it's so typical of so much of what happens in Asian cities. The first binary is that between the planned and the unplanned. To the left, the blue roofs signify a slum, an unplanned settlement. To the right, courtyard homes of the upper middle class. In 2001, Mumbai had 6.25 million people living in unplanned settlements. By 2017, the figure was 9 million. 2/3 of all who live in the city live in a slum. Local governments view these communities as illegal squatters on state land. Dharavi, the largest unplanned settlement in Mumbai, is the most crowded place on the planet. Just to give you a sense of that, Kyoto has a population density of about 3,000 people per square kilometer. Dharavi has 300,000. Many of the people who live there do not have access to running water or toilets. Increasingly, Asian cities must also contend with extreme weather. Here are the facts on a major flood in 2005, what was destroyed and damaged. Of the 1,000 people who died, many were from low-income areas. But to understand a flood, we must visualize flows within this network. Here, the binary of the natural versus the human-made becomes important. This human-made waterway connects to a very important larger natural network. Here is that same site in relation to the Mithi River in Mumbai. Since the 60s, the river's width has been reduced by 50%. A runway at Mumbai Airport created a series of irregular bends. A new business district was sited on reclaimed land. The blue here shows you the river before 220 hectares were taken from it. Mumbai has not only compromised its blue networks, there are also substantial losses to the green space, the green cover, which creates other problems. Peak temperatures in March this year crossed 40 degrees centigrade, 7 degrees higher than the average for that time of the year. Delhi and Chandigarh crossed 45 degrees. The town of Churu, 50 degrees centigrade. While much of this is attributed to global warming, in Indian cities, like much of Asia, this is exacerbated by the loss of urban greenery. Now, despite its troubles, Mumbai has been called India's greenest city. Why? Well, because it has 750 green buildings, more than any city in India. Green buildings like this one in Hyderabad, the first to be certified platinum outside of the US. Green certification recognizes the projects that reduce consumption, increase comfort, etc., and platinum is typically the highest rating. Looking at Mumbai today, though, the problem is not that there are too few green buildings, but that greening a building does not sufficiently address problems at the scale of the city. We find ourselves confronted here by another binary, the building versus the city. Like the other binaries, we accept this with a shrug. On the right, Dharavi, where people live on $1 a day. On the left, Antila Tower, a 27-story single-family home costing $1 billion. The two are in the same city, less than 10 kilometers apart. Some attribute this to an underlying worldview. We have come to see the world as independent elements. Every problem can be divided into parts that can be solved one at a time. This has been called a mechanistic worldview. The flip side of this is an ecological worldview, where the world is many connected and interdependent systems. Groups can coexist. Humans enter a partnership with nature. I'll quickly show you a few examples of what this might look like. This is the farming kindergarten in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, situated within a contaminated industrial estate. It has energy-saving features and water filtration systems, much like any green building. But the thing that captures the imagination is its roof. Here is where factory workers who were once farmers gather on weekends to grow vegetables. Food that is grown here is used in the kitchen of the kindergarten, and excess is shared with the community. Here is another in Seoul. After the Korean War, the city of Seoul grew rapidly. Growth meant more cars, more roads, more highways. In 2002, the then mayor tested a different paradigm of planning. His administration took down a 6-lane flyover and unearthed a stream that was there before it. The Chingnichon stream sees something like 60,000 visitors a day. It also attracts biodiversity. The park has brought down urban temperatures, cleaned the air, and increased real estate value. Businesses have returned to the area. And here's one more. The city of Bandung in Indonesia suffers from urban fragmentation, much like Seoul. This dead space under a flyover was turned into a park by its mayor. On one side of this is an unplanned settlement, on the other, middle-class homes. People from both sides gather here on weekends. Peter Buchanan, the architect and writer, once remarked, "The big critique of sustainability is its failure to describe what constitutes the good life." He was not wrong. Green, it seems, is all about consuming less or doing more with less. Many would say that green buildings are also unattractive, that we have been forced to trade beauty for efficiency. But maybe the challenge now is not what we know constitutes a good life, and I hope the projects I've shown today give a glimpse of that. Maybe the question is how fast we can build a consensus on how to get there. Thank you.
Do you want to have a comment between the two of you, which I think would be interesting at this stage?
Thank you very much. One thing that occurred to me as you were talking, and of course having read your article that is in Museum International, which I encourage everybody to read if you have not already, is this. And considering that we're in a hall full of people who are associated with the museum sector, if you will, what you talk about and what has been achieved in some places and needs to be achieved elsewhere too, requires immense kind of imaginative impulse and force to it. Is there any way that museums, obviously are not the entire answer to what you're trying to achieve, but how could they somehow play a role in achieving the kind of achievement of imagination that you describe in your work?
So let me start by talking about my profession and the problem that I think we face. Architects and planners are highly preoccupied with the past and the present. So much so, I think that it becomes an obstacle to imagining a future. Now, just to give you an example of that, some of the worst devastation that has been caused to cities has been based on modernist planning principles. And we're not yet able to critique our past in a way that lets us think about the future in new ways. There's a wonderful book, if you haven't read it, Yuval Noah Harari on Sapiens, and he talks about imagined realities, wherein communities come together and imagine a world altogether different from where they live in, what they exist in. And I think this is what we lack in my profession. And I wonder if there are ways in which we can not just reflect on the past and the present, but also imagine altogether new realities, new models of urban living that are not yet available to us. I don't know, maybe museums can do something about help with that.
Well, I would hope they could. What occurs to me, it's interesting how you position it. that one of the difficulties in your profession is this kind of reversionary thinking. In other words, you're sort of fighting the last battle rather than imagining what can happen going forward. There's a similar impulse, candidly, I think, in the museum sector, in that we are fundamentally, in terms of our unique contribution to the world and culture, in the position of preserving and conserving, often focused on that which comes to us from the past. But it does seem to me that if you sort of combine some of the things that I was saying and that you're talking about, that museums can become very important intersections, if you will, in trying to not only celebrate legacies that are retrospective, but try to imagine and learn from them to talk about things going forward in the future. And it does seem to me that museums, in addition to being houses of objects, are very much about civic and social space, if you will, where there can be gatherings that are helpful, and even gatherings of sectors that would be most helpful in doing the kinds of things you're talking about, which is government plays a role in that, the private sector plays a role in that, and you have combined both of those things, I think, in doing some of the achievements that you talk about in your piece.
Can I just add one last thing? There's a school of thought out there that the flip side of what we saw this morning with the Amazonian video is what happens in the city. That these are two terrible twins, if you will. And that if we can't fix the city, we're not going to fix the other problem. And I think that there's a book by E.O. Wilson, a biologist, who talks about, he called Half Earth, and he talks about how we have to set aside half the planet for nature, with a capital N, and let it live, and the other half for humans. But that other half has to become self-sufficient. And for that to happen, we have to reinvent the city. So I think a big part of the discussion ought to be, and has to be, how do we reinvent the city? How do we reinvent our homes in a way that gives nature room to exist?
Yeah, well, I agree. And there's a way in which, in many respects, design, if you look at the history of design over the past century or so, it was still sort of in cities coming from a point that didn't necessarily recognize what other factors of well-being there were. The buildings that you're talking about, where you were greening design work, is an ability to bring two things together which somehow have become separated, I think.
Perfect timing. Thank you. As it seems untenable for museums in the 21st century to be silent on the issues of the crisis in nature, likewise, it seems unsustainable for museums to be in denial on the legacies of inequality and asymmetries in power and wealth, issues that have most often been conspicuously and painfully absent and muted in museums. The next speakers discuss how the historic and current conflicts between the global North and the global South and other, often related and intertwined hierarchical systems of values skew the vision and interpretation of museums and permeate the life, body, mind, memories, and emotions of people. They also, however, both of them point to methods of decolonization in the broader sense of that word, of transcending and rebalancing systemic, epistemic, and personal subjugation and oppression. The colonial agenda, says George Bongo in the Museum International, was one of conquest, appropriation of land and resources, and of domination of particularly people by a foreign power. In some cases, like in the Americas, Australia, and some parts of Africa, it led to the annihilation of populations, genocide, theft of land, natural resources, and other heritage resources, which has left lasting and visible social and political and economical scars. George Bongo is known to most of us here as the former director of the National Museums of Kenya, as a former vice president of ICOM, and as a national representative to UNESCO. He is, however, also a great scholar within archaeology and heritage studies, with a number of awards, not least the Knight of the Order of Art and Letters of the Republic of France. He's a former professor at the University of Mauritius and teaches and consults globally. Please welcome Jette Bongo.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. All protocol observed. Let me first of all start by thanking the organizers for the wonderful, wonderful atmosphere that we have here. Well, my talk today in 7 minutes is basically about museums and museum definition as it relates to colonialism. But from this lens also, I also look at the attendant elements that include geopolitics, globalization, and migration, as it were. Well, museums are about people. If you read what I have written there that I can't present in 7 minutes, it's about people and those faces that we see there. And people create heritage, and both are intrinsically related. Well, can we move it on? And intrinsically related, that's what I'm looking at that. Both are intrinsically political. Heritage, on the other side, I see as power, and museums are privileged to be custodians of these very powerful instruments of power. But also, we also need to know that heritage itself is not innocent or neutral, as we may think. Next slide, please. It's full of power, and so it's not neutral. Now, that is why the fathers of UNESCO, in 1946, when ICOM was also founded, came up with the idea that peace can only be constructed, or peace can only be found when we understand one another. And they came with this very powerful saying that war begins in the minds of men, and in the minds of men that peace must be constructed. Now, basically, that we need to be able to reach to one another and share this heritage. And I can say that ICOM, over the years, has tried very much to do that. However, humans also are diversified, with diversified expectations. And the diversification and needs of humans grow through time. And although in terms of museums, the definition by ICOM, which is the family, has served us so well, I think we've reached a stage where it is no longer viable. The question basically boils down to how this definition can continue to serve a fast-changing environment that is still very much defined by historical differences that looks at equality, the issues of justice, the issues of rights, the issues of inclusivity and exclusivity. The underlying reality in this case, basically, is that some parts of the world have undergone immense injustices in human memory, including through slavery and slave trade, as well as colonialism, that have left serious scars, and we live with these various scars. Unfortunately, the museums were beneficiary from both. Colonialism was about extraction, as Jette has just said, of labor, of resources, of heritage, and as we heard from District 6 yesterday, even of the spirit of humanity. And therefore, when this president of France, Macron, in Algiers says that colonialism was a crime against humanity, he is not wrong when he says that the African children and the African youth have the same right as the French youth to enjoy their heritage in their home ground as those French ones. He is not wrong. He is not wrong because of these inequalities, because of these historical injustices. As one professor, Professor Ngugi wa Thiong'o from Kenya once said, they came with the Bibles and told us to close our eyes. And when we closed our eyes to pray, when we opened them, the land was gone, the freedom was gone, and the heritage was gone. We became objects of interpretation and display, and we continue to be so. And we're all aware that Western curators continue to monopolize the use and interpretation of the same heritage acquired under these colonial injustices and cruelty. Of course, Western scholars also continue to monopolize research in the South just because they have resources. The end result, however, is museums. Where then is that justice? When one asks for the heritage back, the answer is that we are not prepared. If we are not prepared, how comes that over 100 years ago you came, you got them, they were in good health, and you took them away? That is the question. The mindset and the language of colonization and its dominant narrative continues, and therefore in the present definition, if the present definition allows that, then something must be wrong. Some museums continue to benefit through illicit traffic, and we know about that. This leads also to conflicts, and conflicts leads to migration. And migration, we have seen that apart from some good causes like in Italy, the Museum of Lampedusa in Italy, where a museum has been able to assist those arrivals. Most museums basically have been defeated. They don't know what to do. Does the definition that we have carry the spirit to welcome these new arrivals in terms of migration in this very fast-changing world? Can these definitions continue to remain neutral and apolitical? Not in the face of a changing world where human rights, justice, multivocality, rights of heritage are being asked every day. Not in a situation where a former jail in the form of Robben Island becomes a voice of the people, fights injustice, and wins freedom for a country. Not where a museum like District 6 fights for the rights of its people to reclaim back its land and the spirit of a dispossessed people. This begs us many, many questions. If indeed we are going to be a hub to work for sustainability, to deal with issues of climate change and environmental destructions, of human rights and inclusivity, then surely we have to do better. And that starts with us now. History remembers those who take risks and bring change, not those who sit back to maintain status quo. If Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Zuckerberg did not take chance, where would the world be today? And I finish by saying, it is not enough to say the Amazon is burning or such and such a group is under threat. We have to do something, and it starts with how we define ourselves. Together we can succeed, and together we can fail. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. And now welcome Soshi Keshi. Soshi Keshi discusses how public art in a colonial context contains, as she says, centuries of old untold trauma and plays its role in sustaining colonial relations of power and normalizing and legitimizing continued acts of violence. The pain, the shame, the humiliation of the historically oppressed are cemented through daily encounters with colonial figures towering over public spaces as remnants of empires, she writes in the Museum International. Soshi Keshi is an associate professor and deputy dean for transformation at the University of Cape Town. Her research centers on political psychology and institutional change, exploring issues of identity such as race, class, and gender, and how these impact on people's participation in transformation efforts. A key focus is on the development of methodologies for participatory action research tools that can raise consciousness and mobilize community groups into social action. Soshikeshi, welcome.
Good morning. First of all, thank you very much to the organizing committee for the opportunity to present this morning. The focus of my talk is on public art and the role of public art as a tool that can both reify and disrupt relations of power in society. The central argument is that public art can sustain coloniality or colonial relations of power, and that the contestation of public art through collective forms of resistance can lead to social change. In illustrating my argument, I am drawing on two examples of public artworks that were contested and subsequently removed from the University of Cape Town campus in 2015. The first is the Cecil John Rhodes statue, and the second is the Sarah Baartman sculpture. In 2015, the Rhodes Must Fall protests at the University of Cape Town led to the removal of the statue of colonialist and mining magnate Cecil John Rhodes from our campus. Students and staff were protesting the colonial culture of the institution and its persistence 20 years after the dismantling of apartheid in 1994. The photographs that you see here is of a student throwing excrement at the statue, which sparked the protests. The symbolism of the performance was to superimpose the realities and the associated shame of the vast majority of South Africans onto a symbol of colonial oppression and domination. These protests had a national and an international impact, with many institutions across the country and the world following suit and removing statues from public spaces. The Rhodes Must Fall campaign was also the precursor to the Fees Must Fall campaign that led to a national shutdown of universities in South Africa that same year. The other photographs that you see here are from a participatory action research project that I led, and where students took photos about the statue that illustrated the impact of public art on daily experiences on campus and in the shaping of consciousness. The photograph on your top left is of the shadow of the statue after it had been removed. And this photograph served to illustrate that even though the statue was gone, there's still much that needs to change in the institutional culture of the institution. It is saying that Rhodes lives on in other ways. The photograph on the bottom right, called Liberation, was taken by a transgender student who was sitting on the same plinth that the Rhodes statue stood on. She explains liberation as disrupting the whiteness and elitist patriarchal culture of the institution, as her body, as a black queer transgender woman, represents the opposite. The second story is of the robing of the sculpture of Sarah Baartman that stood in the main library on the UCT campus. Sarah Baartman was taken from South Africa to Europe as a slave. Her story has been historically told through the icon of the Hottentot Venus. Known for the public humiliation and violence that she suffered in the 1800s in the name of science, it is not surprising that the sculpture became the subject of much contestation. Sarah was displayed half naked in a cage for the enjoyment of European audiences, and after her death, her remains were displayed at the Musée de l'Homme in Paris until the 1970s, and were only returned to South Africa as recently as 2002. During the 2015 protests at UCT, students came together to robe the sculpture as an act of restoring dignity to the memory of Sarah Baartman. This sparked many debates at the university amongst students, staff, and activists. Some were against the robing of the sculpture and claimed it was an affront on freedom of expression. Ultimately, these conversations led to the removal of the sculpture and the renaming of the main hall on campus to the Sarah Baartman Hall. What these examples illustrate is the power of public art in shaping institutional culture and everyday relations of power between people in society. And importantly, they show how collective contestation of public art can lead to a critical consciousness of self and others towards a decolonial aesthetic. Artworks, particularly those displayed in public spaces, are live instruments and political statements that make claims, justify, legitimize, and support ideas and perspective. An engagement with public art in participatory and collective forms of community action can lay the framework for restoring dignity and well-being as part of a decolonial imperative to curate our own history. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. Does either of you want to comment on each other here? I'll give you a little time for this. Yes. Yes?
Yes. Thank you for that very fantastic presentation that you've given. And of course, the two more or less extreme examples. Sarah Baartman, who basically went back in a year, and that shows the extreme part of museum in terms of collections. And Sarah Baartman was a collection until she was taken back, spending over 100 years in Europe. And I think that brings us back to the same question of the collections that we have in terms of humans in Europe. But that aside, I'm very, very interested in your comment in terms of power relations and power base and changing times and the role of museums. Because next door in Zimbabwe, you have Cecil Rhodes buried up in Matopos. And when Mugabe was asked why he was throwing away, the people whom he thought had taken land, and yet Cecil Rhodes was still there, he said it was economic purposes because they were bringing tourists from Europe. On the other hand, when you ask the museum people, the first thing when Cecil Rhodes was being removed from the university campus at Cape Town, I think when the students were asked, where does he belong? They said to the museum. Now, and then I asked another colleague from Zimbabwe also that they had actually removed Cecil Rhodes from the main street in Harare, also ended up in the museum. So the museum plays a role of refuge, at the same time, another role of exposure. What is your comment about this? How do you see that? What is the role of museum in terms of either receiving or disposing of public work?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really difficult and important question. What we experienced at UCT with the experience around the Sarah Baartman sculpture was very interesting because in a lot of people did not want the sculpture removed because it was a symbol of somebody who belongs to us. And so before the sculpture was actually removed, it was placed in a museum, in a gallery on the campus, but within a performance. So there was a photography exhibition, there was text and context given to this person, even though the sculpture was displayed in its original form. So I think the museums can provide that space to curate a particular symbol or artwork or artifact that gives it a particular meaning that can restore some of the false meanings that maybe it does in other contexts. And so it's a very interesting question about Sir John Rhodes, because the sculpture at the moment is in storage. But of course, there are many questions about how long is it going to stay in storage? Is it going to come back one day? So I really appreciate that question. And if perhaps I can also ask something of you. When the students were robing the sculpture, one of the questions that came up for me was, to what extent, if we're going to say museums are spaces for debate and engagement, to what extent can people actually engage with the artifacts? And do they own, do they belong to them? And so where do we draw the line?
I think that's a very interesting question, because it brings us back also to the question of how we look at things and the role of the curator. And especially, I think, in the Western world, the curator knows it all, the curator interprets it, the curator gives you, prepares it, and has a big day, and bang, come and get the big surprise. So that happens on this side. On the other side, we are saying the museum should be a hub. It should be a place of dialogue, which means the communities and everybody of concern, everybody who has a reason to complain, should actually be able to play a role. So I think this gives us a very interesting, quite dynamics on what possibilities are there for us to explore in terms of expanding the understanding of museum, so that it is not just static, that the way we have always been is the way we should always be. For me, I think that is the beauty of the museum, that it gives you space to think, to explore, and to expand the boundaries.
Thank you both. Embedded as they are in the societies around them, museums are directly and indirectly impacted and shaped by complex and often contradictory societal trends, by political and economic shifts and ruptures, by social change. In anticipation of and in response to these changes, museums adjust and reinvent and adapt. New museums emerge that stretch the classic museum model and format. In our period of time, museums are at the same time challenged and queried, but potentially also strengthened by community quest for transparency and participation, and by communities seeking empowerment and agency. The two last speakers here described the increased permeability between museums and the surrounding societies, the more fluid boundaries between museums and the communities and stakeholders, not least the increased public expectations towards partnerships and participation, outreach and inreach, collaborative processes, co-creation, co-curation are bringing profound epistemological and museological innovation to museums. Museums, says Margaret Anderson, seek new methods and ways to address the pressing issues confronting the world in the 21st century. The issues of social inclusion across major divides of race, gender, class, ethnicity, urgent socio-political problems like international migration and mass refugee arrivals, increasing gulfs between rich and poor, the rising incidence of homelessness in Western democracy, and the overarching specter of global warming. Margaret Anderson is a senior public historian and museum administrator who is currently the director of the Old Treasury Building in Melbourne. She's known to many here as the founding director of the Migration Museums in the 1980s, from which she pioneered discussions in Australia, encouraging museums to partner with community groups. She's known for her work as a feminist historian and her consistent focus on how museums can contain and present and express conflicted views of the past. Welcome, Margaret Anderson.
Thank you, Jette, and good morning. It's a great privilege to be here, and can I also express my thanks to our Japanese colleagues for their very gracious welcome. This is Evie. You will have seen her on the cover of the museum definition of Museum International. Now, I'm fairly sure that this will be the only time that Evie features on the cover of a magazine. So this journal has already gone into her special box, her own private museum of memories. At the time this photograph was taken, she was 3.5 years old, and she was absolutely fascinated by the immersive displays at the Singapore Art Science Museum. Museums are some of her favourite places, but her expectations of visiting museums are very different from those of her mother, let alone her grandmother. Evie was born in 2015. Her mother was born in 1981. The current museum definition was framed in its essentials, with some revisions, in 1974. That is almost 2 generations ago. The world of museums and the world itself has been transformed since then. We've already heard in this session how general global trends have influenced museums, driving change in museum epistemologies and in the creation, management, and ownership of collections. But another area of profound change in museums has been the way in which they work with their communities. From at least the 1960s, groups previously invisible in museums began to demand inclusion. First Nation groups sought meaningful involvement in the management and interpretation of their collections. Women claimed a right to inclusion, challenging the master narratives that framed historical discourse and contemporary commentary. Immigrant groups sought inclusion in the stories of nations and place. The single narrative approach to museum interpretation was increasingly challenged. Now, museums are powerful storytellers, however conscious we may be of that role. The stories we present in our galleries, the objects we select for display, the meanings we give them, weave compelling stories about identity, culture, environment, and place. But increasingly we are asked, who writes these stories? Who selects the objects? Whose voices do we allow to be heard? In recent decades, there has been a significant trend towards greater cultural democracy in museums, challenging the hierarchies of knowledge and power that shaped museums in the past, that still shaped museums in 1974. I've called this a process of democratic disruption, and it has transformed the museum landscape profoundly. Yes, the transformation is uneven. The extent of community participation varies from museum to museum, but the overall trend towards inclusive practice is clear. And as I think my colleague Lauren, who follows me, will argue later, the aspiration to be more inclusive is strong amongst many ICOM members. In the place of the single master or national narrative, we find multiple narratives, even conflicting narratives. A diversity of insights drives displays that present an altogether richer, more inclusive vision of a community, culture, or place. Some of these displays seek deliberately to contribute to a process of writing history. Now, while we cannot undo the injustices of the past, museums can contribute towards processes of reconciliation and healing. This is profoundly important work, but it calls for active partnerships, working with and for communities, while still retaining the traditional functions of collecting, researching, preserving, and interpreting collections of cultural material. Museums everywhere seek continuing relevance. It is the key to our survival in a crowded public domain and a rapidly changing world. But it means that museums must embrace critical dialogue, whether reflecting on past events, contemporary culture, or future challenges. Our communities increasingly call on us to contribute to social justice, to acknowledge our own histories of dispossession, and to contribute positively to global concerns, including global inequalities and a warming climate. New digital museum communities remind us insistently that museums are not neutral places. Now, there are many positive examples of inclusive contemporary practice, and here are just two that we learned about in our process of consultation on the museum definition. Museum Rotterdam has an authentic Rotterdam heritage project which holds regular story cafes, museum cafes, in partnership with diverse communities, including new immigrant groups, to build more inclusive and representative collections. Or the Migration Museum in Adelaide, which since 1986 has reached out to new arrivals, including those held in immigration detention centres. Museums can indeed be safe places to explore unsafe ideas or express social and political concern. Here is the most recent School Strike for Climate rally that began from the steps of my museum in May this year with our support. If we needed any confirmation of the engagement of the current generation of young people, here it is. We have an opportunity in museums to engage actively with our communities, to work with them to realise their aspirations for a better world. We want them to be working with us, supporting museums as important cultural institutions, not protesting on our steps, seeing us as part of the problem. And to achieve that, we need a definition of the museum for Evie's generation. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaret. And finally, Lauren Bonilla-Macau, who writes in the Museum International on the methods developed for the roundtable on the museum definition that we did across the globe. Today, she makes a case for democratizing, inclusive, and multivocal museums. She'll discuss how core ethical standpoints and core museological concepts can support new developed models of museums, as well as support established museums in addressing the present issues of our times. Lauren has a PhD in art history and is a professor at the University of Costa Rica, teaching art history and museology. In this ICOM forum, she's known as serving her second term as chair of ICOM Costa Rica, and her work on the boards of the ICOM LAC Regional Alliance and the steering committee of the EU LAC Museum Project that studies community museums and fosters bi-regional interaction and learning. Welcome, Lauren.
Good morning, bonjour, ohayo gozaimasu, buenos dias. It is a great honor to address you today, and I thank the organizers of the conference for this very, very special space and their very special hospitality. One of the aspects I most admire about museums is that they shape themselves around their limitations. Creativity is essential in adapting their mission to the boundaries of reality. All museums face challenges to forge ahead, serve their communities, and meet standards of professionalism despite funding cuts or political pressure. Dedicated museum staff problem solve and multitask to get the job done. When I first became involved in ICOM at an international level, I felt strongly that my Costa Rican colleagues had something to share with the world. I knew the same could be said about my fellow Latin Americans and of professionals the world around. The solutions and best practices garnered under difficult situations in one part of the globe can be easily transferred to those half a world away. in the nonprofit sector, wealth lies in our ability to listen to, learn from, and construct with others. The proposed museum definition complements this idea, as it calls upon a gathering of distinct voices to forge a better world. Museums have a mandate to improve our planet, as the UNESCO recommendation incites us to be proponents of sustainable development. The alternative definition helps museums orient their actions toward this end. Certainly, it is an ideal, but it is also a roadmap for any museum, large or small, urban or rural, professionally run or community-driven. It does not contain the troubling phrase humanity and its environment, as if the environment somehow belongs to human beings. The historically erroneous notion is what has led us to so terribly abuse our planet. Furthermore, it does not set a high ground for stressing terms like permanent institution, prohibitive for initiatives without a secure future. Certainly, one hopes that our heritage be custodied by long-lasting institutions, but in an extremely volatile world on the brink of massive environmental disaster, permanence just shouldn't be a key term. Rather, we must seek to be spaces for critical dialogue. Overwhelmingly, in the roundtable sessions, museum professionals around the world concurred that museums must be gathering places for diverse communities to converge for learning and the exchange of ideas and principles. We need to speak out. We need to be heard. We need to listen. We need to comprehend. Museums can and must be part of the conversation about important issues confronting our times. Immigration, violence, injustice, racism, climate change, sustainability, globalization, all of these topics are apt for museums to approach, while also tackling how identity and history, art and science factor into the discussion. In my reflection on the proposed definition, I have considered it in light of specific cases and want to share 3 examples. First, within my home district is the Ecomuseo de Avangares. This small and struggling community museum recently inaugurated a new installation of its permanent exhibit. Its board of community members is entirely foreign to the museum world, and yet, with 1 staff member and a few dedicated people, they're making steps toward activating and improving the space for the community so that it may better value its local history and natural environment. I have no doubt that the proposed definition could simply and succinctly provide orientation while also reassuring community leaders that their efforts follow a good course. I think of an opposite extreme, and I'm reminded of the exhibition Black Models, From Jericho to Matisse, at the Musée d'Orsay, which focused on the often anonymous figure of the black model, in some cases retitling works to correct bigoted historic identifications. In this way, we see a traditional museum taking on a timely topic, enabling it to address race relations in an increasingly tense and hostile environment. Granted, it could have done more to further engage the public. Nonetheless, it is an example of how a large art museum can focus on pressing issues facing its communities and contexts. A final case is one for which the proposed definition can be tremendously useful and relevant. In Costa Rica, there's a new museum being planned. The Museo Mío, the Museum of Identity and Pride, will soon be the first LGBTIQ museum in Central America. They have formed a foundation and will be partnering with UNESCO next year to fund an initial museological investigation. When I think of the importance of this museum to my belief system, it is my strong wish that we will have the new definition in place to help Mío orient its mission, content, and tone. I want to know that it will be a place where I can take my sons to discuss difficult topics like identity and human rights, where a silenced history can be aired and a minority can freely communicate and prepare the ground for a better future. As stated in the proposed definition, beyond the core practices of collecting, preserving, researching, interpreting, and exhibiting, Museums must enhance understandings. This is truly how our education departments can contribute to worldwide and continuous education. I can only hope that my family will emerge from each museum visit having a better comprehension of our shared world, to thereby consider their position within it. I have come to love the proposed definition. It allows us to address current issues surrounding the field, such as restitution and transparency. It may be a bit long and even cumbersome, but it says what I want it to say. It reflects what I believe, that museums can and must play a stronger role in our societies. We are ethical spaces run by committed professionals. Museums must be more active as a source of good. Old or new, traditional or community, public or private, museums have to step into the chaotic mess of a world in which we live, to help out, to garner knowledge, to be arbiter, to offer inspiration, to serve as guide, to provide edifying diversion, to foster a culture of peace. We can and must keep working on the definition for years to come. It's a morphing entity. But let us give the world this altered vision of what a museum is, and let us align our definition with what museums are already doing. By supporting the alternative definition, ICOM will be encouraging museums to actively partner with communities, to enable spaces for diverse opinions and experiences to come together, all as a means to contribute. And I conclude using the words of the proposed definition because there are none better, to contribute to human dignity and social justice, global equality, and planetary well-being. Thank you, merci, arigato gozaimasu, gracias.
Now we are a bit at a crossroads. We are running late, of course, and obviously. So strike that one. And the question is whether we should also strike the next one, which was supposed to be a panel discussion between everyone. Does anyone there have a really, really important comment to someone else? Then I'll allow it. Otherwise, I'll move on. No one? Okay. God, they are disciplined, aren't they? Because we are improvising a little bit here at the end. I would like to invite comment from the floor, a structured comment from the floor, and invite first Bruno Boulon from ICOM, which has been one of the committees who raised their doubts about the phrasing and the way that the new definition has come about. So let's invite Bruno first up here to say a comment. So strike these guys for a while.
Good morning, everyone. I will be short because I was given some few minutes to express a point that's, as Jette has already announced, structured and based on opinions from different national and international committees. First of all, I would like to thank FuturArc for opening this space to diversity in this panel, and to Jette Sandahl for supporting it. I'm here representing a group of at least 26 national committees and 8 international committees who signed a letter presented to ICOM inviting the ICOM community to postpone the Extraordinary General Assembly of 7 September so that all of us, the ones here in Kyoto and the wide ICOM community, including those who are not here, can have some more time to reflect on the new definition that is being proposed. These national and international committees that I represent in this panel that share this position wish to recall the operational nature of the ICOM definition, which is incorporated in many national and international legislation, understanding that some time should be given to the museum community to experiment and discuss the new terms that are being proposed. In this sense, the participation of these committees in the implementation and debates regarding the definition is fundamental for the appropriation in its different contexts of the world of the new text. For the past few days in Kyoto, instead of thinking of what is opposing our opinions, I decided to try to exercise the thinking on what is uniting us here in this conference and in the debate towards a new museum definition. Firstly, after speaking to several persons, including specialists and community leaders involved with museums, I can conclude that we all consider that a change is needed. But a change is always a process, and it is never easy. So our goal here in Kyoto or in the following years is to try to find a way to negotiate the terms to this change within the wide community of professionals who we here have the responsibility to represent. Is the museum undefinable? I was asking myself yesterday. In fact, yes. Both in practice and in theory, we will never have a universal definition that is broad enough and at the same time accurate. Look at our diversity. We all here represent the different institutions and the different experiences that identify with the term museum. So it's obviously going to be difficult to define it. So what are we doing here trying to define the undefinable, one could ask? Well, we are trying to find common ground, I think. The museum definition is part of ICOM identity. Somehow it expresses our main message to museums and the people who make them in the different parts of the world. It tells the world what ICOM is about and what it stands for. So when we discuss a definition, we are trying out a new identity, and it tells a lot about ourselves. Of course, it's not going to be an easy process, and democracy is not an easy process. So I would like to emphasize that the fact that we are having differences here, it's a good thing, because it's being democratical, and we are trying to establish a democratical process. In a polarized world where we live, let's find the best way to express our message, understanding that change is a process and it might take more time than just a yes or no vote. So expressing our great respect for the work that has been done by the Standing Committee on the Museum Definition, we consider that the following years should give us the time to ponder on its results. Several questions have been raised. Many people have expressed their opinions. We had several symposiums and publications. So we need time to discuss it further. What we are proposing here is an opportunity for the museum community and the ICOM community to try to discuss and experiment the terms of a definition that is never going to be definite. And I would like to remind us, saying that sometimes to vote yes or no, like recent history has shown, doesn't really result in democracy. Sometimes it can result quite in the opposite. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bongo. As a second commentator, I would like to invite Lonnie Bunch from ICOM US, which has been one of the national committees who's actively supported and advocated on behalf of the new definition. Are you here, Lonnie?
I am here, right over here.
Can you come up here?
Do I have to?
Yeah, it's nice to be up where we can see you. Oh, well, maybe we can see you there. Maybe it's just me not seeing you.
I'm getting formal. Hell with formality. So, the issue for me is simple. There is never enough time to say yes or no to something as important as defining this. My whole career has been about people telling me the time is not ready to make the changes we believe in. I have been told often, wait, we're almost there. Give us a little more time and we'll become the profession that helps the public embrace ambiguity. We'll become the profession that will help the public understand itself by illuminating all the dark corners in its experience. For me, the process that has gone on has been really, I think, very effective and very good. And I think it's important for us to debate, to discuss, but to vote while we're here together. How long do we wait? How long do we postpone really getting to the point that says, this is not saying there's a group that believes that we are right and the other group is wrong. What this is simply saying is that the profession has changed so much and that we all want to find the way to make sure that the museums we love are of value. What we're simply saying is there are traditional values, but where we are as a profession is, as it says up here, we're looking at the future of tradition. So we want to make sure that we debate, but that we're not held captive by that tradition. And that in essence, what we're doing is looking to a future where museums are inclusive, museums are of value, and most importantly, museums play a role to help the public find tools to close the chasms that divide us. It's aspirational, but isn't that what we all want? We want to make a world better. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lonnie. Thank you, everyone. I think we have to close. There are two different sessions, workshops this afternoon, where people can come and discuss and have their voices heard. And let's thank everyone and each other for this morning.
Thank you very much for moderator and the speakers. Lunch is available in the annex hall. Please do not hesitate to ask our staff if you have difficulties in finding your way to the lunch venues. Shuttle bus bound for satellite venue Inamori Memorial Hall is available at the entrance annex hall for every 15 minutes. It will take approximately 20 to 30 minutes from ICC corridor to satellite venues. Please plan enough time to get to the satellite venues for international committees meetings. If you have used a receiver for simultaneous interpretation, please return it to the staff at the entrance. Thank you very much for your participation. Moderator、スピーカーの皆様、ありがとうございました。ご昼食はアネックスホールにてご用意しております。国立京都国際会館アネックスホール入り口より稲森記念会館行きのシャトルバスを15分間隔で運行しております。国立京都国際会館とサテライト会場間の移動には20分から30分程度かかります。時間に余裕を持って移動してください。会場への移動、場所などご不明な点がございましたら、お近くのスタッフまでお声かけください。 同時通訳レシーバーをご利用された方は、会場入り口にてご返却ください。ご参加ありがとうございました。